What if I told you the world has already come within minutes, sometimes seconds, of global annihilation? Moments when one wrong move, one misunderstood signal, or a single stubborn leader could have plunged us into World War III. Today, we rewind the clock to 5 hair-raising episodes, from the Cold War to last year, when civilization stood on the edge of the abyss and somehow stepped back. 1. The Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days on the razor's edge, October 1962. It was October 1962. It was October 1962. And the world was just one wrong move away from nuclear catastrophe. For 13 terrifying days, the United States and the Soviet Union stared each other down over the tiny island of Cuba. But what was at stake was nothing less than the survival of humanity. It began when American spy planes captured images of Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors were stunned. These weren't just weapons, they were first-strike missiles, capable of wiping out Washington, New York, and most of the East Coast in minutes. Tensions escalated rapidly. The U.S. imposed a naval blockade, what they called a quarantine, around Cuba, daring Soviet ships to cross the line. Meanwhile, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was not backing down. Then came October 27th, 1962. The day historians now call Black Saturday. A U.S. U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. At the same time, another U-2 accidentally flew into Soviet airspace. Fighter jets scrambled. Nuclear submarines lurked below. And somewhere in the dark ocean, a Soviet sub named B-59, under pressure and surrounded by U.S. ships, prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. The one man, Soviet officer Vasily Arkhipov, refused to authorize it. His quiet act of resistance may have saved the world. Eventually, the secret deal was struck. The U.S. would remove its missiles from Turkey, and the Soviets would dismantle theirs in Cuba. For 13 days, the fate of the planet hung by a thread, and it was held not by war machines, but by the decisions of a few exhausted, frightened human beings. This wasn't just a Cold War standoff. It was the closest we've ever come to World War III. 2. Able Archer 83. The NATO drill that looked too real. November 1983. In November 1983, a NATO military drill nearly triggered a real nuclear war. The exercise was called Able Archer 83, and on the surface, it was just a simulated command post training. A practice run for how NATO would respond to a nuclear threat. But to the Soviet Union, it didn't look like a drill. It looked like the real thing. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Cold War was at a boiling point. President Ronald Reagan had called the USSR an evil empire. The U.S. had deployed Pershing II missiles to Europe, and Soviet leaders were deeply paranoid that a surprise American nuclear attack was imminent. Then Able Archer began. What made this drill different was its realism. Live-coded communications were used. Nuclear command procedures were rehearsed. High-ranking officials were involved. To Soviet spies watching from afar, it looked like the U.S. was preparing to actually launch. The KGB's top-secret Ryan intelligence program, designed to detect Western nuclear intentions, went on high alert. Soviet bombers were put in the air, and missile units across Eastern Europe were quietly placed on combat footing. The world was one misunderstanding away from disaster. So, how did we survive? A British double agent named Oleg Gordievsky, who had infiltrated the KGB, secretly warned the West. The Soviets believed this was a real prelude to war. NATO commanders, startled by the revelation, dialed down the drill and avoided further escalation. Most of the world never knew how close it came. Most of the world never knew how close it came. Able Archer 83 proved a terrifying truth. When the line between simulation and reality blurs, war can begin by accident. And in 1983, it nearly did. Stanislav Petrov's false alarm. The night the computers lied, September 26, 1983. It was just past midnight on September 26, 1983. Deep inside a secret Soviet bunker outside Moscow, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat at his console, monitoring the early warning system designed to detect incoming American nuclear missiles. Then, alarms began to blare. The screen flashed. Missile launch detected. 1, then 2, then 3. Eventually, 5 U.S. nuclear missiles appeared to be in the air, heading straight for the Soviet Union. Petrov had 2 choices: report the attack up the chain of command, which would trigger an immediate Soviet retaliation, or assume it was a false alarm and risk letting a real attack go unanswered. The official protocol was clear: notify the Kremlin, launch a counterstrike. But something didn't add up. 5 missiles. That's not how a real first strike would happen. It would be hundreds, thousands, not 5. Petrov hesitated. He used his instincts, not the computer. I had a funny feeling in my gut, he later said. I didn't want to be responsible for starting World War III. So he broke protocol. He marked it down as a false alarm. And he was right. It turned out to be a malfunction in the satellite warning system. Sunlight reflected off high-altitude clouds had tricked the sensors into thinking launches had occurred. Had Petrov followed orders, the Soviet Union would have launched a full nuclear response to a ghost. Petrov's calm judgment in that moment, while the world slept, likely prevented global nuclear war. Yet for years, no one even knew his name. He wasn't honored. In fact, he was reprimanded for not logging the incident properly. But today, we remember him for what he truly was: the man who saved the world by trusting his gut over a machine. In October 1973, the world's most volatile region erupted into war again. And this time, it nearly dragged the superpowers into a nuclear confrontation. On the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, a coalition of Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a surprise attack on Israel, catching its defenses off guard. Within hours, tank battles raged across the Sinai and Golan Heights. The Middle East was on fire. As the war escalated, the United States rushed arms and equipment to support Israel, while the Soviet Union began airlifting supplies to Egypt and Syria. Then came a chilling moment. Intelligence reports revealed that Soviet ships might be carrying troops and possibly nuclear weapons toward the conflict zone. That's when Washington hit the panic button. On October 24th, 1973, the U.S. military was ordered to DEFCON 3, its highest alert level since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear bombers were loaded. Submarines quietly moved into launch positions. American forces were suddenly ready for war, not just with Egypt or Syria, but with the Soviet Union. President Nixon, embroiled in the Watergate scandal, was largely absent, so Secretary of State Henry Kissinger took control. Behind closed doors, initiated intense diplomatic back channels to Moscow, warning them that any Soviet troop movement could spark World War III. Fortunately, the Soviets stood down, and a fragile UN-brokered ceasefire followed days later. But the aftermath was global. The Arab oil-producing nations imposed an oil embargo on the West, causing fuel shortages and economic shockwaves worldwide. The world dodged another bullet, but the message was clear. The Middle East isn't just a regional hotspot. It's a global flashpoint. And when nuclear powers pick sides, every skirmish has the potential to end the world. In 2024, the world got a frightening glimpse into just how fast a regional conflict could spiral into something far worse. It began on the night of April 13th, 2024. For the first time in history, Iran launched a direct military strike on Israel, firing over 300 drones, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles in a single coordinated attack. Tehran called it retaliation for an Israeli airstrike on its consulate in Damascus. But to the world, this was uncharted territory, a sovereign nation attacking another openly, not through proxies, but face to face. As missiles flew toward Israeli skies, alarms blared in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa. But within hours, an extraordinary air defense operation unfolded. Israel's Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow systems, assisted by US, UK, and Jordanian forces, intercepted roughly 99% of the incoming threats. The world watched in real time. Had even one warhead struck a major Israeli city, the response would have been catastrophic. But the tension didn't end there. On October 1st, just 6 months later, Iran launched a second wave. Operation True Promise's second wave. Operation True Promise's the second. This time, 200 ballistic missiles aimed at strategic and civilian targets across Israel. While Israel again intercepted the majority, falling debris killed civilians, sparking calls for massive retaliation. What made this moment especially dangerous was how close the conflict came to dragging in major world powers. Iran warned that if the U.S. directly intervened, it would strike U.S. military bases in the region. Israel hinted at using unprecedented force, language many interpreted as a veiled nuclear threat if its survival was at stake. And both Russian advisors in Syria and U.S. carrier groups in the Mediterranean sat uncomfortably close to the action. According to reports, Israeli and American officials had a mere 4-minute window to determine if the incoming missiles were conventional or nuclear-tipped. 4 minutes to make a decision that could change the course of history. Fortunately, diplomacy prevailed. The attacks were contained. War was avoided. But the message was crystal clear. In our hyper-connected, weapons-saturated world, it takes less than 5 minutes to go from warning siren. It takes less than 5 minutes to go from warning siren to World War III. World War III has almost begun more than once. Yet, every time, reason, luck, or a single brave soul pulled us back. But here's the takeaway. The closer humanity dances with advanced weapons and hair, trigger politics, the more we rely on people, fallible, emotional people, to say stop. Which of these near misses chilled you most? Comment below. If you learned something new today, like, share, and subscribe for more deep dive history that matters for our future.